They thought the truth would stay buried forever. They believed your soulmate would never discover who had been quietly poisoning the connection between you. But tonight, the person responsible finally lost control. And one confession shattered the entire story. Your name came out. The lies came out. And the real reason you were kept apart was finally exposed. What happened next was something nobody in that room was prepared to hear. Listen carefully. Because this was not a simple misunderstanding, and it was not a case of two people naturally growing apart. For a long time, your soulmate had been carrying a version of the story that was carefully built for them. They were told that you had stopped caring. They were made to believe that you had chosen a different path, that you had secretly moved on, and that reaching back toward you would only bring humiliation and rejection. Every time they questioned that story, someone close to them stepped in with another explanation, another warning, another perfectly timed piece of information designed to make the distance between you feel permanent. Your soulmate did not understand why certain conversations about you always seemed to end the same way. Whenever your name came up, the subject would suddenly change. Whenever they admitted that they still wondered about you, somebody would remind them of an old mistake, a painful memory, or a rumor that made them doubt everything again. What they never realized was that one person had been standing behind almost every one of those moments. That person knew exactly which fears to use. They knew your soulmate's weaknesses, their insecurities, their loyalty to family, and their fear of making the wrong decision. They didn't need to openly demand that your soulmate stay away from you. Their manipulation was quieter than that. A sentence here. A warning there. A message conveniently left unanswered. A conversation twisted just enough to make your intentions look completely different from what they really were. And slowly, your soulmate started believing that walking away from you was something they had chosen for themselves. That was the cruelest part. The person responsible wanted them to feel as if the separation had been their own decision, because then nobody would ever look for the real hand behind it. But something changed recently. Your soulmate started noticing contradictions. Stories that once sounded convincing suddenly stopped matching. Dates were wrong. Details were changing. One person claimed you had said something on a day when you could not possibly have been there. Another conversation revealed that a message your soulmate believed you had ignored had apparently never reached you at all. And then came the detail that disturbed them most. Someone casually mentioned a private conversation about you that they should never have known about. Your soulmate didn't react immediately. They stayed quiet. They started remembering. They began putting together moments they had ignored for months, maybe even years. The same person always appeared whenever you and your soulmate were getting closer. The same person always had a reason why the timing was wrong. The same person somehow knew what both of you were saying while making sure neither of you knew what the other had actually said. Don't skip. Because this is where the entire situation exploded. Your soulmate finally confronted them. It did not begin with shouting. In fact, that made it even more intense. Your soulmate simply asked one question: why did you tell me they wanted nothing to do with me? The room changed immediately. The person tried to laugh it off. They said your soulmate was confused. They claimed they had only been trying to protect them. But your soulmate was prepared this time. They mentioned another message. Then another conversation. Then a promise that had supposedly come from you but had never actually been spoken by you. Every excuse created another contradiction. Every denial opened another hole in the story. And suddenly, the calm person who had controlled this situation for so long started losing control of themselves. Their voice got louder. Their explanations became messy. They accused your soulmate of being ungrateful. They said they had done everything for their own good. But your soulmate kept asking the same question: did you keep us apart? That question was repeated until there was nowhere left to hide. And then it happened. The person slammed their hand down, stopped pretending, and finally said the words your soulmate had spent so long searching for. Yes, I did. The silence afterward was heavier than the confession itself. Your soulmate stared at them as if the person standing in front of them had suddenly become a stranger. But the confession didn't stop there. Once that first truth came out, everything else began pouring out with it. They admitted that they had intercepted information. They admitted that they had exaggerated disagreements between you. They admitted that they had convinced your soulmate that you were preparing to leave long before you ever made such a decision. And when your soulmate asked why, the answer was even more disturbing because it revealed this had never really been about protecting anyone. They were afraid of what would happen if you and your soulmate stayed together. They believed your presence would change your soulmate's priorities. They were afraid your soulmate would stop depending on them. They worried that certain family decisions, financial plans, personal loyalties, and long-standing expectations would fall apart if your relationship became permanent. To them, your connection was not simply love. It was a threat to the control they had spent years building. And instead of trusting your soulmate to choose their own future, they decided to quietly choose it for them. Your soulmate asked, "Did they ever try to reach me?" The person hesitated. That hesitation told your soulmate everything. They asked again. This time the confession was quieter. Yes. Your soulmate's face changed completely, because they had spent so much time believing you had disappeared without fighting for the connection. They had replayed that pain in their mind again and again. They had wondered how someone who once seemed to care so deeply could suddenly become silent. But now they were discovering that silence may never have been yours. Messages had been discouraged. Information had been withheld. Opportunities to speak had been deliberately destroyed before either of you realized they existed, and then your soulmate asked the question that made the person finally break down completely. What did you actually say about me? For the first time, the person couldn't look them in the eyes. They admitted that you had never said some of the cruel things your soulmate had been told. You had never mocked their feelings. You had never announced that they meant nothing to you. In fact, there had been a moment when you had apparently asked about them with more concern than your soulmate had ever been allowed to know. That single revelation hit them harder than everything else. Because suddenly, memories they had forced themselves to bury returned with a completely different meaning. The days they thought you didn't care. The nights they almost contacted you but stopped themselves. The moments they allowed someone else's words to become stronger than what they had once personally felt with you. Now your soulmate understood that the story they had been grieving might never have been the real story at all. But the confession still wasn't finished. Because just before leaving the room, the person who had kept you apart admitted there was one final thing they had hidden. Something connected to the exact moment your soulmate made the decision to walk away from you. And when your soulmate heard what had really happened that night, they stopped the person at the door and said, "Tell me everything." Right now, your soulmate didn't move from that doorway. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. The expression on their face had changed so completely that the person standing across from them finally understood there was no way to escape this conversation anymore. For years, your soulmate had been carrying anger toward you, disappointment toward you, questions about you, and a painful belief that you had chosen silence when it mattered most. Now, in a matter of minutes, that entire emotional foundation was collapsing. They looked directly at the person who had just confessed and asked, "What happened that night? What did you hide from me?" At first there was no answer. Only a nervous glance toward the floor and a long silence that made your soulmate's heartbeat feel louder than anything else in the room. Then came the sentence that changed everything again. "You were supposed to meet them that night." Your soulmate froze. They remembered that night clearly because it had become one of the most painful turning points in their entire connection with you. They had waited for something from you, a call, a message, some sign that you still wanted to fight for what existed between you. Nothing came. At least, that was what they had believed. By the next morning, they had been told you had made your decision and wanted distance. They were shown what looked like proof. A message. A short statement. Something cold enough to convince them that you had finally given up. Your soulmate asked through clenched teeth, "Was that message really from them?" The person didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation was enough to make your soulmate step closer. Was it really from them? They asked again. Finally, the person admitted it. The message had been altered. Not completely invented, but deliberately changed. Pieces had been removed. Words had been taken out of context. A message that had originally carried uncertainty, pain, and a desire to talk had been made to look like a final goodbye. That revelation hit your soulmate like a wave. Suddenly they remembered exactly how they had felt after reading it. They had sat alone, staring at those words, forcing themselves to accept that you no longer wanted them. They had told themselves not to call you because they didn't want to appear desperate. They had deleted drafts they almost sent. They had ignored the instinct telling them something didn't feel right. And all that time, the truth had been sitting somewhere just beyond their reach. Your soulmate demanded to see the original message, but the person claimed it was gone. Deleted long ago. forgotten, irrecoverable. Yet the way they said it sounded wrong. Your soulmate noticed it immediately. "You're still lying," they said. "You confessed because you were cornered, but you're still protecting something." That accusation broke whatever control the person had left. They began defending themselves again, saying your soulmate didn't understand how complicated things had been, how much pressure the family was under, how many people believed the relationship with you would cause problems. But your soulmate was no longer interested in excuses. "You let me believe they abandoned me," they said. "You watched me hate someone for something they never did." The person fired back that your soulmate had eventually moved forward, that life had continued, that reopening the past would only create more pain. But those words made things worse. Your soulmate realized this person wasn't sorry because they had hurt both of you. They were sorry because the truth had finally escaped their control. Then your soulmate asked another question. Who else knew? That question created a new kind of silence. Because until that moment, your soulmate had assumed one person had been manipulating everything alone. But suddenly the person's expression suggested something larger. They tried to avoid answering, but your soulmate pressed again. Who else knew you were doing this? Finally, a second confession came out. One family member had suspected. Another had been told a partial version of the plan. Someone else had even warned them that interfering would eventually destroy the family's trust. But nobody had stopped it. Some stayed silent because they believed the separation was temporary. Others stayed silent because they thought your soulmate would eventually forget you. And one person, according to the confession, actively helped create distance between the two of you. Your soulmate's eyes widened. Who? The person whispered a name. Your soulmate immediately shook their head. That was impossible. The person named was someone they trusted. Someone who had comforted them after losing you. Someone who had listened while they cried, while they questioned themselves, while they tried to understand why everything had fallen apart. That same person had apparently known more than they ever admitted. Your soulmate remembered being told, "Maybe it's better this way." They remembered hearing, "If they wanted you, they would have fought harder." They remembered being encouraged to stop checking their phone, stop waiting, stop hoping. Now those words felt completely different. What once sounded like comfort suddenly sounded like carefully disguised persuasion. Your soulmate stood there trying to understand how many people had participated in building a false reality around them. But one question mattered more than all the others. "Did you know any of this?" they asked, referring to you. The answer was no. You had apparently been fed a completely different story. While your soulmate was being told you wanted to leave, you were being made to believe your soulmate had chosen family expectations over you. While your soulmate believed you had stopped reaching out, you had been led to believe your attempts were unwanted. Two people were pushed in opposite directions while both were quietly told the other one had already made their choice. Don't skip. Because this is the moment your soulmate finally realized the separation may have been engineered from both sides. They sat down slowly, overwhelmed by everything they were hearing. Their anger had not disappeared, but now something else was rising beneath it: regret. Not the simple regret of losing a relationship, but the devastating regret of realizing that some of their biggest decisions had been based on information that was never true. They remembered conversations with you that ended too quickly. Moments when you looked hurt but said nothing. Times when they expected you to fight harder while you may have been waiting for them to do exactly the same thing. They whispered, almost to themselves, "We were both waiting." The person who confessed heard that and finally started crying. They admitted there was one moment when everything almost fell apart. You and your soulmate had nearly discovered the truth much earlier. A mutual connection had tried to arrange a conversation between you. The person responsible found out before it happened and stopped it. They told your soulmate the meeting had been cancelled because you didn't want to come. They told you your soulmate had refused to see you. Neither statement was true. Your soulmate suddenly stood up again. When? The date was revealed. And the moment your soulmate heard it, their face went pale. Because they remembered that exact day. That was the day they had made one of the biggest decisions of their life based on the belief that you had rejected one final chance to speak. But there was something even more shocking. The person admitted that somebody had secretly recorded part of the conversation that happened before that cancelled meeting. The recording had never been destroyed. It still existed. And according to the confession, your voice could be heard clearly on it saying something your soulmate had never been told. Your soulmate looked straight at them and said, "Bring me that recording." The person didn't move. Because what was hidden on that recording wasn't only about whether you still loved your soulmate. It revealed who had started the entire separation in the first place. The person who had confessed stood completely still after your soulmate demanded the recording. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Your soulmate could see fear replacing the anger on their face, and that fear confirmed something important. The recording was real, and whatever was on it was far more damaging than anything they had admitted so far. Your soulmate repeated the demand, slower this time. "Bring me the recording." The person tried to argue that hearing it would accomplish nothing, that too much time had passed, that reopening everything would only create another disaster. But your soulmate had already spent too much of their life living inside somebody else's version of the truth. They weren't going to accept another excuse. "You controlled what I believed once," they said quietly. "You don't get to control what I hear now." That sentence ended the argument. The person eventually walked toward another room and returned holding an old phone and a small storage device that looked as if it had not been touched in years. Your soulmate stared at it in disbelief. All this time, the truth they had needed had apparently existed inside something so small. The person hesitated before handing it over and warned that the recording was incomplete. Your soulmate immediately understood what they were trying to do: create doubt before the evidence was even heard. They ignored the warning, opened the audio file, and pressed play. At first there was only background noise. A door closing. Someone moving across a room. A few muffled voices. Then your voice became clear. Your soulmate stopped breathing for a moment. They had not expected the sound of your voice to affect them so strongly after everything that had happened. But hearing you from that specific time pulled them straight back into a version of their life they had spent years trying to forget. Your voice sounded emotional, but not angry. Hurt, but not finished. And then the sentence came through clearly enough that nobody in the room could pretend it meant something else. I don't want this to end without talking to them myself. Your soulmate closed their eyes. For years they had believed the exact opposite. They had believed you were the one who refused that final conversation. They had been told you wanted distance, that you had already decided that forcing another meeting would only embarrass them. Yet there you were on the recording asking for exactly the conversation they had wanted too. Your soulmate replayed the sentence. Then again. Each time, the betrayal became harder to process. It wasn't simply that someone had lied. Someone had taken a moment when both of you were still willing to speak and deliberately made sure that conversation never happened. But the audio continued. Another voice entered the recording. Your soulmate recognized it instantly, the trusted person whose name had already been revealed earlier. The same person who later sat beside your soulmate and comforted them after the separation. On the recording, that person told you something that changed the entire story again. They've already made their decision. Their family comes first. They don't want you there. Your soulmate's eyes opened immediately. That's a lie, they whispered. They remembered that day. They had never said those words. In fact, they had been waiting for you to show up. They had spent hours wondering why you never came. And now they were hearing the person responsible tell you that your soulmate didn't want to see you. Then your voice answered. Did they actually say that? There was a pause. Yes. Your soulmate stood up so quickly the chair behind them shifted across the floor. The person who had confessed tried to explain that everyone had believed separation was best at the time, but your soulmate wasn't listening anymore. They were staring at the phone, waiting for whatever came next. Your voice sounded quieter now. If they really said that, I'll respect it. But tell them I never wanted to disappear. Tell them I was willing to stay and talk. That was the moment your soulmate broke emotionally. Because nobody had ever told them. Nobody had told them you were willing to stay. Nobody had told them you had asked for one final conversation. Nobody had told them that even after believing you were unwanted, you still left behind a message that carried care instead of resentment. Instead, your soulmate had been told you walked away without looking back. They covered their face for a moment, trying to control everything rushing through them. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with grief for the years that could not be recovered. They began remembering how many times they had spoken badly about that moment. How many times they had told themselves, if they cared, they would have stayed. Now they knew you had tried. The recording should have ended there. But it didn't. A few seconds later, after you apparently left the room, the voices on the recording continued. And this was the part nobody expected your soulmate to ever hear. The trusted person said, "What if they contact each other directly?" Another voice replied, "Then we make sure neither believes the other." Your soulmate slowly turned toward the person standing in the room. The audio continued. They discussed blocking communication without making it obvious. They talked about using family pressure. They talked about making each of you believe the other had moved on first. And then one sentence revealed the real beginning of the plan. This has to happen before they find out what was promised. Your soulmate immediately paused the recording. What promise? Nobody answered. They looked at the person who had confessed. What promise were they talking about? The person shook their head and said it had nothing to do with you anymore. Wrong answer. Your soulmate played the audio again. This time they listened more carefully. After some background noise, another voice said, "If those two stay together, the old agreement comes back, and then everything changes." Now the situation was no longer only about control, jealousy, or family approval. There had been an agreement. Something older than the separation itself. Something connected to what would happen if you and your soulmate remained together. Your soulmate demanded an explanation. The person finally admitted that years earlier, two people from both sides had made a private promise involving your future and your soulmate's future. Most of the family never knew the complete details. But when your connection became serious, somebody realized that the old promise could no longer stay buried. And instead of allowing both of you to discover it, they decided separating you would be easier. Your soulmate stared at them. What was promised? The person refused to say. They claimed they only knew part of it. But your soulmate no longer believed partial answers. They searched through the remaining files on the storage device and noticed one more audio clip recorded several days after the first one. The person immediately reached toward the phone. "Don't play that." Your soulmate pulled it away. Why? Because that second recording was not made secretly around you. It was a private conversation between the people who had planned the separation. Your soulmate pressed play. A familiar voice began speaking. And within seconds, your soulmate heard your name followed by a sentence that made the entire room go silent. If they ever discover what was signed, they'll know we had no right to keep them apart. Your soulmate stopped the audio. What was signed? This time, the person finally looked terrified. Because the answer was not hidden in another recording. There was an actual document. And according to them, your name was written on it. Your soulmate stared at the person across the room as if every remaining piece of trust had just disappeared. A document. Your name. A private promise. Suddenly, this was no longer only about manipulated messages or a meeting that had been deliberately destroyed. Somebody had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep the two of you from discovering something that had existed long before the separation. Your soulmate lowered the phone and asked one question: "Where is it?" The person tried to pretend they didn't know exactly what was being asked. Your soulmate didn't allow them to escape. The document. The one with their name on it. Where is it? This time there was no shouting, no argument, no attempt to negotiate. The person simply looked away, and that tiny reaction told your soulmate that the document had never been destroyed. They admitted it had been hidden with other old family papers after the separation. Nobody expected it to matter again because everyone believed you and your soulmate would eventually build completely separate lives. But that wasn't what happened. Even after the distance, even after the silence, even after other people tried to redirect their future, your name continued returning in conversations, memories, and decisions. That frightened the people who had worked so hard to separate you. If your soulmate ever became curious enough to investigate the past, the document could expose not only what had been promised but exactly who had known about it. Your soulmate demanded that it be brought out immediately. The person refused. They said, "You don't understand what opening that file could do." Your soulmate answered, "Neither did you when you destroyed years of my life." That silenced the room. After several tense minutes, an old folder was finally pulled from a locked cabinet. It looked ordinary: faded edges, handwritten dates, several folded pages inside. But your soulmate's hands shook when it was placed in front of them. The person who had confessed warned them one last time not to read it without hearing the full explanation. Your soulmate ignored them. They opened the folder and began moving through the papers one by one. Most were irrelevant: old correspondence, family notes, legal-looking copies, signatures from people your soulmate barely remembered. Then they reached a page marked with a date from years before your separation. Your name was there. Not handwritten later, not added as a note. Typed into the original document. Your soulmate stopped. Under your name was their own. For a few seconds, they simply stared at both names sitting together on the same page. Then they noticed something even stranger. The document referred to a commitment that would become important if your relationship ever reached a certain stage. It wasn't a marriage contract. It wasn't proof that anyone had arranged your relationship. It was something more personal, a promise made by people who had once believed that if you and your soulmate chose each other freely, neither family would interfere, pressure either of you into another relationship, or use money, reputation, obligation, or family expectations to separate you. Your soulmate read that section twice. Then a third time. Their face changed. Because the people who later insisted that your connection was wrong for the family had once agreed in writing that the decision should belong to the two of you. Your soulmate looked up slowly. You knew this existed? The person admitted they did. Then why did everyone act like our relationship was forbidden? No answer. Your soulmate turned another page. That was where the truth became uglier. Years after the original promise was made, circumstances inside the family had changed. Money was involved. Expectations had changed. Certain relationships between relatives had broken down. Someone had begun planning a future for your soulmate that depended on them making a very different choice. And by the time your connection with them became serious, the old promise was no longer convenient. Instead of admitting that the family had changed its position, someone decided it would be easier to make your relationship destroy itself. That way nobody would have to openly break the promise. Nobody would have to admit they were interfering. And most importantly, your soulmate would believe leaving you was their own choice. Your soulmate pushed the folder away in disgust. So all those warnings, all those conversations about duty, all those people telling me I was hurting everyone by wanting this. They already knew they had promised not to interfere. The person finally said, "Not everyone knew." That answer caught your soulmate's attention. Who did? The names began coming out. One relative had known the entire time. Another knew only that an agreement existed. A third person had been told to make sure your soulmate never found the papers. And then came the name that hurt the most. Someone your soulmate had trusted completely had signed the original promise. The very same person who later looked your soulmate in the eyes and told them that choosing you would destroy the family. Your soulmate's expression went completely blank. They turned back to the document and found the signature. There it was. Real. Undeniable. The betrayal suddenly felt much deeper than the manipulation itself. This person had not simply changed their opinion. They had hidden their own promise and then used your soulmate's loyalty against them. They knew exactly what they were doing when they said, "If you really care about this family, you will let this relationship go." They knew your soulmate would sacrifice their own happiness rather than feel responsible for hurting people they loved. And it had worked. For years. Your soulmate stood up and walked toward the window, trying to process everything. The room behind them had become painfully quiet. Then they asked a question nobody expected. "Did you ever know about this document?" The person said no. At least, not at first. That phrase immediately made your soulmate turn around. At first? The person realized they had made another mistake. Your soulmate moved closer. When did they find out? The confession came slowly. Apparently, sometime after the separation, you had discovered that something about the family story didn't make sense. You had asked questions. You had spoken to someone older who remembered the original promise. You had never been shown the complete document, but you had learned enough to realize that the reason you were given for the separation was not the full truth. Your soulmate's voice dropped. What did they do when they found out? The answer hit even harder. You tried to reach them again. Not once. More than once. And somebody stopped those attempts too. Your soulmate immediately demanded to know how. The person admitted that one message from you had actually made it through to someone inside the family. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. You had asked for only one thing, the chance to speak directly with your soulmate without anybody standing between you. Your soulmate asked, "Where is that message?" Nobody spoke. "Where is it?" Finally, the person pointed toward the same folder. Your soulmate searched through the papers until they found a sealed envelope tucked behind the final page. Their name was written on the front. Your handwriting was underneath it. For a moment, your soulmate couldn't open it. This wasn't a manipulated screenshot. This wasn't somebody else describing what you supposedly felt. These were your own words, written at a time when your soulmate believed you had completely forgotten them. They opened the envelope. The first lines immediately destroyed another lie. You wrote that you had never wanted the relationship to end through other people's words. You wrote that if your soulmate truly wanted you gone, you would accept it, but you needed to hear that decision from them directly. You admitted you had been told they chose family expectations over you, yet something inside you still believed that wasn't the entire truth. Your soulmate had to stop reading. Because they had never made that decision directly. Somebody had made sure you believed they had. They continued. You wrote that you didn't want revenge, arguments, or family conflict. You simply wanted the truth. And then came one sentence your soulmate read again and again. If there is even one part of them that still wants this conversation, please don't take that choice away from us. Your soulmate's eyes filled with tears. Because that was exactly what had happened. The choice had been taken away from both of you. But there was another page inside the envelope. Your soulmate unfolded it. This one was shorter. And at the bottom was a date. The date shocked them because it wasn't from years ago. It was much more recent. Your soulmate looked at the person who had confessed. You said this was old. The person's face went pale. The second page proved that somebody had heard from you again far more recently than your soulmate had been told. And your final sentence on that page was not about the past. It was about now. You had written, "If they ever learn the truth, tell them I never stopped wanting to hear what they would have chosen without everyone else deciding for them." Your soulmate folded the letter slowly. Then they asked the question that terrified everyone in that room. Do you know where they are now? The person who had spent years keeping you apart looked at the floor and whispered, "Yes." But when your soulmate demanded the answer, they revealed one final detail. You weren't as far away as your soulmate had been led to believe. And someone had spoken to you very recently. Someone who was sitting in that room right now. The room went completely silent when your soulmate heard that someone sitting right there had spoken to you recently. Every face suddenly looked suspicious. Your soulmate slowly turned toward each person, searching for the reaction that would expose the truth before anyone even spoke. And then they saw it. One person near the corner lowered their eyes and tightened their hands together. Your soulmate immediately knew. It was you, they said. The person didn't deny it. They simply whispered, yes. They reached out to me. Your soulmate stepped closer. When? The answer came quietly. It had happened only weeks earlier. You had contacted this person because you had finally discovered enough pieces of the old story to understand that something had been deliberately hidden. You weren't trying to destroy anyone's family. You weren't demanding that the past be rewritten. You had asked only one question: do they know the truth yet? When you were told that your soulmate still didn't know everything, you had gone silent for several seconds before saying something that now hit them harder than any confession they had heard that night. You said, "Then don't force them toward me. Just tell them the truth and let them decide for themselves." Your soulmate's eyes immediately filled with emotion. Because after everything that had been taken away from both of you, you still weren't trying to control their choice. You were asking for the exact thing everyone else had refused to give them: freedom to choose. Your soulmate looked around the room and finally understood the difference. The people who claimed they were protecting them had lied, hidden messages, manipulated conversations, and decided what their future should look like. But you, the person they had been taught to distrust, had asked for nothing except honesty. That realization changed something inside them. They no longer wanted another explanation. They wanted you. Not because an old promise said they should choose you. Not because a document connected your names. Not because guilt was pulling them backward. They wanted the conversation that should have happened years ago. Your soulmate asked for your contact information. The person hesitated and said, "Before you do this, understand something. They don't know you found the recording. They don't know you read the letter. And they definitely don't know you're thinking about reaching out." Your soulmate nodded. Good. Everyone looked confused. Your soulmate continued, "For once, nobody is going to speak for either of us." Then they picked up their phone. The person who had caused the separation suddenly started pleading with them not to make an emotional decision. They warned that too much had happened, that the past couldn't simply be erased, that hearing your voice might reopen feelings neither of you could control. Your soulmate turned around and said something that ended the argument instantly. "You were never afraid of our feelings. You were afraid of what we might choose if we knew the truth." Nobody had an answer. Your soulmate walked out of the room carrying the letter, the recording, and the document that had exposed years of manipulation. But before leaving, they stopped at the door and looked back at the person who had finally confessed everything. "I may never get those years back," they said. "But you don't get another day." Then the door closed. Later that night, your soulmate sat alone with your contact information in front of them. For several minutes they did nothing. Their hand hovered over the phone while memories rushed back: your last real conversation, the misunderstanding, the silence, the nights they wondered whether you had forgotten them. Now they knew you hadn't disappeared the way they were told. You had tried. And somewhere along the way, you had been hurt by the same lie. Your soulmate finally typed a message. They deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. There were too many things to say and no sentence seemed big enough to carry all those lost years. So they stopped trying to explain everything. They wrote only, "I know the truth now. And if you're willing, I want to hear the story from you." They stared at the message for several seconds. Then pressed send. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Your soulmate placed the phone down, trying to prepare themselves for the possibility that the truth had arrived too late. Then the screen lit up. A message from you. Your soulmate's hands shook as they opened it. Your reply was simple. "I've been waiting for the day you would ask me directly." They covered their mouth as tears filled their eyes. Then another message appeared. "But before we talk about what happened, I need you to know one thing." Your soulmate waited. Your final message came through. "I never hated you. I hated that we were never allowed to choose for ourselves." And suddenly, everything became clear. This wasn't about pretending the past never happened. It wasn't about instantly fixing every wound. It was about two people finally standing face to face with the truth instead of somebody else's version of it. Your soulmate called you. This time, nobody intercepted the call. Nobody changed the message. Nobody stood between you. And when you answered, there was silence for a moment before your soulmate whispered the words they should have been allowed to say long ago. "I'm sorry I believed them before I asked you." You replied softly. "And I'm sorry we lost so much time." Your soulmate took a breath. "Can we finally talk?" You answered, "Yes." This time, everything. And for the first time in years, your story was no longer being controlled by the person who separated you. The lies had collapsed. The confession had been made. The truth had reached both sides. And whatever happened next would finally belong to you and your soulmate alone.